I'm hoping things are going to work out well. Everything this morning has been perfectly lined up to where I hopefully can take us this morning. Early this morning, I decided to take this into a two-part series. You'll be thankful for that, I'm sure. Since I'm known to be a shorter speaker, I really didn't want to ruin my trend. But because of that, it's a little bit more data up front than I would really like to lay on you. And I'm going to take a quick survey. I probably should have done this a couple years ago. But who here likes history? Like enjoys history? Hey, not excellent. I thought for a moment I just need to walk out right here. But it's very difficult to read the Bible and step into the story. It's complex. There's so many different layers and things that are happening that makes it difficult to put the stories in the proper narrative, put them in the right place in time and space. One of the harder ones to do that is actually the one we're looking at this morning in the book of Esther. We read it. It's fairly early on in our order of our books of the Bible, but it plays a very significant part in a lot of the things that are happening. So we're going to try to explain a little bit of the context that leads into this story, because it's a powerful, powerful context. But I want to start with the question: has your life turned out how you thought it would? Have you ever, guys, they call it midlife crisis. They end up with a Corvette or a motorcycle, or you know what I mean. They get to a certain point in their life and they go through this crisis because it's not as much that they don't always be unhappy as much as realizing that they're not going to accomplish what they thought they could do. And in our minds they're running things like, oh, well, I'm never going to be a Major League Baseball star, too late. And you begin to cross things off your list and go, well, I'm not going to be able to do that. I'm not going to be able to do that. I'm not going to be able to do that. And before long, the world closes in around you and you sit there and going, wow, what I thought I could do, I can't do. Have you ever looked at your life and say, I'm unusable? I'm worthless. Things aren't going as I thought they would. Our dreams are shattered. Life has not happened as we wanted to. Maybe it happens when you're born into a depression or an economic downturn. You lose a job, things happen, you're in an accident, not your fault. You have a disease, nothing you can do about it. And before long, the world comes in around us and how can God use me when this happened? Or since this is going on, how can God step in and do this? So this morning, I kind of want to do this through the book of Esther and see God's narrative winding through this, his story that's happening, that is far greater than we can ever imagine, in a far bigger stage that we can even comprehend with this book. And so much of this book is not even mentioned in the story. But yet in the history lessons, in the history books, it fills volumes that's happening. If you have a paper Bible, please turn to Esther. We are going to be in the first two chapters. If you don't have a paper copy, if I can rope a couple people in here to pass out these. If you don't have a paper copy, would you mind passing out on this side? If I can get a volunteer on this side. Oh, John, thank you. It's just I want you to have it in your hand if you can. A phone is okay, but I highlighted a couple things in here because I want this to pop out to us. And we'll be getting to more of that story as we go on. I'll be using the name Esther, even though Hadassah shows up into it, but both are in the story, and I'll get to why that is happening here in a little bit. But this character is an amazing point in time. The book of Esther is laid on top of one of the greatest moments of military history that has ever happened in the world, if not the greatest. This story is not in silence. It's not in a secluded place. It is happening with one of the major conflicts to ever happen in that world. So the Battle of Thermopylae occurs when a Greek force of about 7,000 men held off an army of 150,000 fighting men. 7,000 up against about 150,000 Persians. And they did it in a very small pass where the sea was up against the cliff face. There was about a 20-yard pass, and these 7,000 men began to hold off this marching 150,000 strong army of the Persians. You might know that King Leonidas of Sparta led the defending Greeks. He realizes that he's surrounded, and he sends most of his troops away, and now only 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and 400 Thebans fight to the death. Now, you may recall this because Hollywood made a movie of it called The 300 about 15 years ago. You might remember the famous lines because Cyrus the Great sends out his ambassadors to all the nations in the Greek peninsula and the Greek Isles to give them a little bit of earth and a little bit of water in representation that he has conquered that area because of the Persian mighty army coming. Most countries did that. He gets to Sparta, and the ambassador is asking King Leonidas, will he give him earth and water? And Leonidas begins to laugh and mock the ambassador. And the ambassador for Cyrus the Great can't believe this. How dare you talk to ambassador of Cyrus the Great? And he says that the words of King Leonidas are madness. Madness? You call this madness? This is Sparta. And every guy knows that line. During this conflict at the Battle of the 300, when later they meet and are discussing this, Xerxes now is coming back to do this in the second battle. We'll explain this a little bit more. But he says, we are so outmatched, we're going to fire so many arrows at you, it's going to block out the sun. And the response is, then we will fight in the shade. And this conflict, one of the greatest battles of all time, is happening in the story of Esther. So when we look at the beginning of Esther, we don't see the entire world narrative that's happening. We just see a very brief snapshot of what's happening. And so when we try to apply these lessons into our lives, or we try to read these stories and say, God, how does that apply to me? What does this story have to do with our time? How is your story now being enacted in our world? We have to put it in this history. Because when we look into history, begin to see God moving throughout these entire narratives of these stories, all throughout time, all through these stories, it continues on, and God is raising up people and characters to further his message. And it's a weird narrative when you begin to look at it, because we only see the characters of the Bible. We don't put it onto the world stage. So I want us to step back and run through some of these stories just to help us give that framework, so when we go through Esther this time, and then the next time finishing out Esther chapters 3 through 8, we begin to comprehend what's happening. So it begins, I want to step back and begin with the captivity by the Babylonians into Israel itself. In 598, we know that the Babylonians come through and conquer Israel, destroy everything, and lays waste to the entire nation. And they haul all of them back into captivity, except the poor, the lame. There's only a few left behind. You remember in Psalms 137, it talks about how them as a people now are sitting alongside the rivers of Babylon. And it says, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There in the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They say, sing unto us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I don't remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day of the Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. Tear it down to its foundations. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who will seize your infants and dash them against the rocks. So this is the context of who is in the Babylonian Empire. These Jewish people that have now come out of captivity in 598 BC and are now slaves in the kingdom. You move forward in time, and then the Assyrians come to power under Cyrus the Great in 550 BC. He liberates the Jewish nation. He defeats the Babylonians. You remember Belshazzar and the writing on the wall. And now the Jewish people who had been slaves for 50 years are now set free. The Persian Empire is a unique empire because it includes many nations. It's not an ethnic kingdom. It's not an Egyptian ethnic group. It's not a Greek ethnic group. It's the Persian. It's the Medes and the Persians. And so in Ezra chapter 1, King Cyrus of Persia sets out a decree and tells them to restore the temple in Jerusalem. And Josephus tells us that he begins to think of himself as the savior figure in Isaiah. And so he restores and tries to start rebuilding the temple. But this Persian Empire is a new empire. It's a new entity of all nationalities, of all kingdoms, all being put in together, all now fully Persian. And under Nehemiah now in 536 BC, the Jews begin to come back into Judah to rebuild and restore the kingdom of Israel. Only about 50,000 Jews return. Hundreds of thousands are still in Babylon. Why move back? Why move back to an area that has been torn desolate? There is no structure. They're barely surviving. Why leave the amazing kingdom of Persia with all of its wealth now that you're free and living in Persia? Why move back to Israel? So most stay in Persia. After Cyrus the Great, then Cambyses, his son, steps in. And he rules from 530 to 522. He mostly stays in Egypt. He doesn't really care about the Jewish people. He actually stops the temple from being rebuilt. The next king, Pseudo-Smerdis, he is a Mede of the Medes and Persians, and he then tries to implement this new religion called Magiism. He's not successful. He is assassinated by the one that we would look at as the major hero in these stories. Darius the Great in 522, and that begins the story in Ezra chapter 5, where they are starting to try to rebuild this temple again, and the governor of the Trans-Euphrates in Ezra chapter 5 tries to stop it, sends a letter to Darius, and Darius then returns with a response, which I love. He says, "Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices, and let its foundations be laid, and let the expenses be from the revenues of the Trans-Euphrates," the kingdom that is just trying to stop it and make them pay for everything. And they do. So now this new Persia is budding. And right after this, then, you will see that the first Persian war I have put up here happens, and then Xerxes the Great happens in our story, is responsible for the second Persian war. So when you begin to read Esther chapter 1, it says, this is what happened during the time of Xerxes. And Xerxes, who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush. You are talking about a massive world-dominating empire. It's hard for us to understand what's happening here, but this is bigger than the United States. This is when England was dominating the world stage. If we can think of these massive empires, that's happening. And it says in the third year of his reign, in verse chapter 3, he gave a banquet for all of his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes, nobles, and the province were present. And for a full 180 days, he holds a banquet. That's a big banquet. So, to help us, I know I'm doing a lot of data, a lot of history, bear with me. Hopefully I have a little payoff here at the end. I want us to look at what the headlines of the newspapers would be saying that lead into this story. And now that we got the bigger context of what's happening in the Persian Empire, what's happening with the Babylonian Empire, I want us to look at Darius the Great in the first battle that is taking place. Because about a 20-year period before Xerxes comes to power, there is an uprising in the Ionian states. This is the western side of Turkey. So the Ionian Empire create a skirmish out here, This is Susa. This is the capital most of the time, Babylonia, or Susa is where they are. So they go out here to squelch this uprising in Ionia. This was backed by the Athenians. The Athenians were mighty warriors of that time, and they back this Ionian revolution that's happening. And he vows that he is going to go in and march out there and destroy the Athenians. He wants to wipe them off the map in roughly around 500 BC. He gets there, and about 490, there's the Battle of Marathon. So he's over here in the Ionian states. The Athenians are backing him, and he vows to wipe them out. He sends his military might this direction, and then his sea, all of his ships and vessels are going this way, and they come in here and meet at Marathon. Now, some of you will recognize this story because the Battle of Marathon is at the end of the summer, August, September, and it's very, very hot. And he lands north of here, and the Athenians begin to realize that the whole Persian army is out there to get them. Unfortunately, they're majorly outnumbered, outgunned, outshipped, everything about them. So there is somebody by the name of Pheidippides of the Athenian army who runs to Sparta. He takes off a 150-mile run, leaving Athens to come down here to Sparta to try to get the Spartans to join in the fight. He does the run in 2 days, 150 miles. Gets there, and the Spartans say, our religious law forbids us to go to war unless it's a full moon. Full moon's not for 6 more days. So, what does Pheidippides do? Takes a nap, it says, turns around, and runs back. In 2 more days, he reruns the 150-mile journey. He gets there, and what's amazing, he gets to Marathon, and amazing what's happening is they're winning. These hoplite soldiers of metal armor against the wicker shields of the Persians. They have long, strong spears against this lightweight army that's usually on horses in open spaces. And these Athenians know this terrain, know this area much better, and they just destroy their armies. So, he jumps on his running shoes again and runs from Marathon to Athens, the 26 miles. And that's why we get the word marathon. But he gets there and declares that the Athenians have won, and falls over and dies. So those of you who want to run marathons. So this is the beginning of what, we got to remember what's happening here. Darius now has just lost a significant battle. So he is hightailing it back home to regroup. The problem is, on his way back, the Egyptians hear the story, and they create an uprising. So he heads to Egypt to squelch that uprising and dies in 486. So now, Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, comes to power at the age of 35. Immediately after the death of his dad, this begins the story of Esther. So this 35-year-old son just lost his dad after they lost a significant battle on the world stage, is coming to power with a significant chip on his shoulder. It's not just Xerxes. The world stage is in unrest. They're about ready to lose the Persian Empire. What is he going to do? So he sets out to create the largest army ever formed. How do you do that? How do you get the world stage to come behind you and support and give you loans and lend them to your armies and put together all this? Well, what do? You put on the biggest banquet ever held in the world. For 180 days, you bring prince after prince and you feed them and show them the lavishness of the Persian Empire. Because he has to show them this is the new Persia. This is the greatest military in the world. We are the best. So Esther chapter 1 begins with a king with a serious attitude problem. I'll mention this just so we can come back to it. Esther chapter 2 begins with the word later, or after these things. There's a lot of time happening here that's doing this. So he does this for 180 days, builds his army, and then marches back over to the Battle of Thermopylae, which is against Leonidas of Sparta. This is Sparta, the 300 defend, and he is massively outnumbered and destroyed. I mean, he is just desolate again. So when Xerxes is coming back, he lost the war that he thought he could win. He lost his queen during the banquet, and now comes home. That's the end of chapter 1. Between this, chapter 1 and 2, that whole activity has just happened. A couple years have passed. He's now back, and now chapter 2 begins with a guy who's depressed without a queen, begins to feel bad about himself, and that's that moment in history. Step out of this story now. Who is God going to call to continue his story? A global power is falling apart. The political figureheads have laid waste to the country. Their economic situation is just destroyed. All of the princes and the kingdoms that has been underneath their provinces are disheveled and almost falling apart. Who is God going to call for a solution? See, we miss this type of activity in the Bible. We don't see it in this stage where the world's in turmoil, chaos is abounding, and God says, oh, I need a new president. No, he says, who's out here? That call girl. I think I can use that. If we want to set a theme for Esther, we have to set this theme of God's great story and the preservation of his people. It's a very interesting book because you will not find God's name mentioned in that book at all. When you look at it, the canonicalization of Scripture, Esther is one of the ones that almost didn't make it time after time after time because it didn't have God's name in it. It also doesn't have the word prayer in it. It's not a good, clean book. I mean, what Esther is doing isn't something that we would want to raise up. You will see fasting, but no prayer. These Jewish people aren't even doing what's right because if you read through this, Mordecai, it says in chapter 3, on the 13th of Nisan is in Susa. Well, what is the 14th of Nisan? Feast of Passover. Where should he be? He should be in Jerusalem because God said that every male should be in Jerusalem. So Mordecai is not even following God's will. There's a reason why Mordecai doesn't have a problem with Esther entering a one-night stand with the king pageant. These aren't godly people that we would look at normally. They're outside of God's law. They're wayward. They're unsure of what's going to happen. Even if you look at what's happening in Jerusalem, even there they don't even have the scrolls that they're even reading the word. They're in a period of unrest there as well because they've been laid waste. But God is still, with wayward people, preserving the story. Now in chapter 1, you see this grand picture of bad decisions by a drunk king. He's extremely arrogant. It starts by saying that he's over 127 provinces. He begins to pull all of his princes in attendance, the army officers, all of the nobles, and has this feast for 180 days. There's a 6-month party at the palace, and you're going to see glory, majesty, all of this. He even invites the poor people and just the average normal people into the palace, and they're walking through the palace with these white linens that are bleached and offering them gold goblets filled with wine. And he's like, even the poor people are welcome into my kingdom. I'm giving them free stuff. And the problem with that is when you give somebody something, they're going to want something more. and he becomes prideful in what he's doing. And now you have a bunch of simple farmers walking through the palace, oohing and awing over what's happening, probably wishing they could grab a goblet and stick it in their toga and disappear. A part of that, then, it says that they could do according to every man's pleasure. Queen Vashti at that point is having a banquet of her own, and Xerxes wants to display her before the people in this crown because this is the new Persian, and she represents what it should be to be Persian. Beautiful, authority. It's almost as if they're putting this where she is the Lady Liberty, or think of that imagination point where she is held in regard to be over Persia. But in this, she refuses. Why? Well, you've got drunken peasants in the palace. Some people even think that it just says that she was only to wear her crown. And he wants to parade her through this. So now, in trying to show his power, he makes a vital decision and casts her out of the kingdom. So chapter 1 ends with this belly flop of bad decisions. The queen is exiled. And now chapter 2, it says his anger has subsided. Why? He's got bigger things to worry about. He just lost a significant war. And now we have his pain of regret. And in his regret, he gets the princes together and they say, King, I think we need a new queen. And to do this, I think we need to have one that is beautiful and sexual. Now, you just lost a major war. Your queen is exiled. Picking the next queen, you might want to have a little different qualifications than that. I think these princes could run political parties in the United States. Let's find one that's the most beautiful. But now he's here, and this banquet now for the next queen happens. So we see the beginning of the king's pain in chapter 2, the first 4 verses, but then it switches. And you begin to see the focus here of the pain of Esther. Because I want you to look at this. It says that she has already been exiled. So she's no longer a part of her people, and she's living among the captives. So Israel is laid waste. Her parents have died. She's outside of home, away from her national honor, now living with the exiles, and now as a young girl being taken to the palace, so now she lost her freedom. You want to talk about thinking, how can God use me? You're 14, 15, 16 years old. Your parents died young. You're now in a foreign land. Your uncle thinks it's a great idea for you to be in a beauty pageant where the ultimate winner has to lay with the king. For 1 year, you have to prepare for that night. Can God use that? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if she likes it or not. She's being trained daily to please the king. So when we look down through the end of chapter 2, or this part of chapter 2, recognize the pain that she's in, away from home, away from her nation, away from her uncle. Her freedom's taken away from her, and now she has to prepare to be the king, to go to be the king. But when we look at God's story, God looks at this and understands pain. He realizes that no matter how bad it looks right now, his plan is happening. It's hard to trust God in that situation. What do you even do? Like I said, they don't even mention the word God in this. They don't mention the word prayer. I don't even know if they know how to. And sometimes we get in situations that we don't even know how to respond. We don't even know how to cry out for God. The children of Israel did this in Egypt. They just cried out. What should we cry? You think, well, where is God? Where is his prophets? And Esther is reading the daily item or the daily news and realizing, wow, this world is falling apart. What's going to happen to me? How could she play any part in this? But this is exactly what God is looking for. Looking for somebody that cries out, even if it comes through a call girl. I don't know your story. I don't know what situation you're in or what difficult scenario that you find yourself in. The pain that you're going through. Some have lived lives filled with shame. Some that are in just impossible situations. I don't think you can get in a more impossible situation that she's finding herself in. But he's able to do things, and you can see him working out these masterful scenarios, and you're going to find out towards the end of Esther how beautiful this is and what it actually happens to the world stage and how it impacts it. But when we see how dark this situation is, and I don't know how much darker it can be when you're being prepared for a one-night pageant with the king at 14 or 15 years old. But just when it seems the most impossible, that's when God begins to act. So the first part of chapter 2 is pain. The second part begins her response. As she's being prepared to be presented to the king, you begin to see that she obeys. She does what they ask her. She obeys what Mordecai says. Because he tells her, please don't tell them your nationality. Don't tell them your name. Esther literally means the hidden named one. The one who's protecting herself. She also begins to build relationships around her. She works with the eunuch and talks with them and listens to his advice and says she asks for nothing more than what he says. She's not there flaunting it or living up the life. She's doing only what is required of her. And then God begins to elevate her because it says that everybody knew her, loved her, and she was loved more than the other women. She was just doing all that she knew what to do. She begins to trust. You begin to see the story begin to morph from chaos, pain, anger. Who knows the story now into she's beginning to walk. She's beginning to follow the messengers, either Mordecai or some of the stories of the king. And through the pain, we begin to see this unveiling of a story. If you look at Esther, without Esther, there wouldn't be a Jewish people. Without a Jewish people, there wouldn't have been a Messiah. I ask this question of us: who does God need to redeem our world? What will it take? Will it take a president? Will it take a Supreme Court official? Or maybe a call girl? It may be somebody with a life that they can't imagine that God would use them. I'll put this in here, even though this is the ending of the book. Xerxes ruled for 15 years, and his son killed him and the family. We don't know what happens to Esther. Most likely was killed. But when we look at these stories, we don't know our story. We don't know how our life will end. But for a moment, God just weaves this through and says, look at my powerful plan that's coming through here. The world stage is happening. Kings are rising and falling. Will you obey? Will you begin to walk? And before long, this mess that she is in becomes the message, because now she begins to write these edicts across the land and saying, will you obey? Will you obey? Or are you going to listen and follow after this God? I'll close with this thought. What would happen if all that you did was begin to take that step? It may be in a brothel. It may be in the harem. It may be in a destructive wasteland, but you begin to listen and do all that you know to do to seek God. And time after time, we see these beautiful stories come out of the Bible where not only do they preserve their people, but you got to realize that Christ, Messiah, comes when people begin to follow after God and pursue them with all their heart. And just imagine what your story would look like when you let God move in it and join his story. Hopefully the next time we get together, I want us to look at Esther, the queen you thought you knew, and how she tries to play and tries to work out her way of restoring, and how God says, okay, your ways are okay, but let me move. Let's go ahead and stand. Father God, help us this morning to recognize your story. It's a lot of data, it's a lot of details, but put that in our foundation so when we read Esther, we begin to realize the magnificent plan that you have out there. Every little thing is for a reason. We can't see it, we don't understand it. We know that sin is in the world and plays a part against us, and we wrestle against that constantly. But help us to listen for the voice. Help us just to take that first step in saying, God, today I want you to lead and be a part of this story. And who knows, in our lifetime, in the lifetimes after this, Esther never dreamed that the line of the Messiah would be redeemed. But it was. Help us to go from here today and be this light among our families, even this darkest point of life. And the world around us is in turmoil and chaos. But in that moment, we can trust it because your ways are perfect. Help us to have an enjoyable afternoon and fellowship and worship you together. In Messiah's name, amen.